Harlem, New York, November 12th, 1963. Bumpy Johnson received a phone call at 2:30 in the morning that pulled him from sleep and sent him into the cold November night wearing yesterday's clothes because there wasn't time to worry about appearance when someone was dying and had asked specifically for him. The call had come from Harlem Hospital. A woman named Sarah Mitchell was in the final stages of cancer. She had maybe hours left, and she told the night nurse that she needed to see Bumpy Johnson before she died, that it was urgent, that she had something to ask him that couldn't wait until morning because morning might be too late. Johnson didn't know Sarah Mitchell personally, had never met her, had no idea why a dying woman he'd never spoken to would ask for him in her final hours. But the nurse had been insistent. "Mrs. Mitchell says you'll understand when you get here. She says it's about the children. Please come." If you're watching this story about the deathbed promise Bumpy Johnson made to a dying mother and how he kept it for the rest of his life, drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. And subscribe so you never miss the stories that show the complicated truth about legends we thought we understood. Johnson arrived at Harlem Hospital at 3:15 a.m. The halls were quiet, the fluorescent lights harsh against the darkness outside. A nurse led him to a room on the 4th floor. Small. 2 beds, one empty, the other occupied by a woman who looked far older than her 54 years because cancer and poverty and exhaustion had aged her beyond her time. Sarah Mitchell was awake when Johnson entered, propped up on pillows, breathing with difficulty, but her eyes were alert, focused. She looked at Johnson with an expression that combined hope and desperation and the kind of determination that comes from knowing you're dying, but having one last thing that needs to be handled before you can let go. "Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for coming. I know you don't know me. But I know you. Everyone in Harlem knows you." Johnson pulled a chair close to her bed, sat down. "Ma'am, the nurse said you needed to see me. Said it was about children. How can I help you?" Sarah Mitchell took a breath that clearly hurt, started talking. Her story came out slowly. Pauses for breath, pauses to gather strength. But the story itself was clear. She'd been a schoolteacher for 28 years, had taught at Harlem elementary schools where kids came hungry and left hungry because the families couldn't afford to feed them properly, where winter coats were luxuries, where medical care was something you did without, because the cost was impossible. 10 years ago, she'd started taking in children. Not officially, not through any agency, just kids who needed somewhere to go. Orphans. Children whose parents had died or abandoned them, kids who were living on the streets or in situations that were destroying them. She'd never married. Had no children of her own, had lived in a 3-bedroom apartment that she'd somehow transformed into a home for children who had nowhere else. She fed them with her teacher's salary, clothed them with donations, loved them with everything she had. Over 10 years, 50 children had passed through her home. Some stayed for months, some for years. She found them foster families when she could, helped them get adopted when possible. But she'd always been there, always been the safety net, always been the person who made sure no child in Harlem went completely without someone who cared. And now she was dying. Had known for 6 months, had tried to make arrangements, but there was no system in place for what she'd built. No official organization, no foster care agency that could take 50 children. No one who understood that these kids weren't just names in a file, but were actual human beings who'd already lost too much and couldn't afford to lose the only stability they'd ever known. "Mr. Johnson," Sarah said, her voice getting weaker, "I have 32 children living with me right now." 32. The youngest is 4 years old. The oldest is 17. They're good kids. They go to school. They help each other. They've become a family. But when I die, child services is going to come. They're going to split those children up, send them to different foster homes, different families, tear apart everything we built. And some of those kids won't survive it. Some of them have already been through too much. This is their last chance. Johnson leaned forward. Ma'am, I understand this is important. Ma'am, I understand this is important, but I'm not sure what you're asking me to do. I'm not exactly in a position to help with child services. Sarah looked directly at him, held his gaze with an intensity that made Johnson understand this wasn't a request from someone confused or desperate. This was a calculated decision from a woman who'd thought very carefully about what she was asking and why she was asking him specifically. I'm asking you to take care of them, she said. Not personally. I'm not asking you to raise 32 children, but I know you have resources. I know you have connections. I know you can make things happen that normal people can't make happen. I need you to make sure those children stay together. Find them a good home, a good family, people who will love them. And I need you to make sure they're supported. They have food and clothes and medical care and a chance to go to school and become something more than what they were born into. I'm asking you, Mr. Johnson, to promise me that you'll protect these children the way I protected them. That you'll make sure they don't get lost in a system that doesn't care about them. That you'll give them the chance I won't be here to give them. Johnson sat back in his chair, processed what this dying woman was asking. The implications, the responsibility, the fact that she was entrusting him, a criminal, a man who made his living from illegal gambling, with the futures of 32 children. This is where Bumpy Johnson proves that power isn't just about control or money, but about what you choose to do when someone who has nothing asks you for everything. If you're still watching, comment below what city you're from and hit subscribe. Because what he said next defined who he really was. Mom, Johnson said slowly, I've done a lot of things in my life, most of them illegal. Some of them things I'm not proud of. But I've never lied to someone on their deathbed, so I'm going to be honest with you. What you're asking is complicated. Child Services doesn't listen to people like me. And finding one family to take 32 children, that's almost impossible. Oh, but I'll make you a promise. Those children won't be split up. They won't get lost in the system. I'll make sure they're taken care of. Not just for a few months, for as long as it takes. And I'll make sure they know that a woman named Sarah Mitchell loved them enough to spend her last hours making sure they'd be okay. Sarah Mitchell smiled, a real smile, the first one since Johnson had entered the room. She reached out her hand. Johnson took it, held it gently. Thank you, she whispered. I knew you'd help. Everyone says you're a bad man, but I've watched you. I've seen how you treat people in Harlem, how you help people when they need it. I knew you'd say yes. She pulled a worn notebook from under her pillow, handed it to Johnson. Everything you need is in here. Names, ages, medical information, their stories. Please read it. Please know them. They're not just numbers. They're children who deserve better than what life gave them. Johnson took the notebook. I'll read every page, he promised. Sarah Mitchell died at 6:23 a.m. on November 12, 1963. Bumpy Johnson stayed with her until the end, held her hand, told her the children would be fine, let her die knowing someone would keep the promise. When Johnson left the hospital that morning, he carried Sarah Mitchell's notebook and a responsibility that would change how he spent every dollar he made for the rest of his life. The first thing Johnson did was read the notebook, all of it, every name, every story. He learned about Tommy, age 4, whose parents had died in a house fire, about Maria, age 12, who'd been abandoned by her mother and found by Sarah living in an alley, about James, age 17, who'd been headed toward a life of crime until Sarah had shown him there was another path. 32 children, 32 lives that Sarah Mitchell had saved. 32 futures that now depended on whether Bumpy Johnson could keep his promise. The second thing Johnson did was call Theodore Green, his attorney. Told him about the promise. Asked what was legally possible. Green's answer was complicated. New York's child services system in 1963 wasn't designed for situations like this. Group homes existed, but were overcrowded and underfunded. Foster care meant splitting children up. Adoption agencies wouldn't take 32 children as a single group. The only option was to create something new. A private facility. Technically a group home, but funded privately rather than through the state. It would require licenses, inspections, staff, legal paperwork, and money. A lot of money. How much? Johnson asked. Initial setup, maybe $50,000, Green estimated. Then about $5,000 a month to operate. Food, clothes, medical care, staff salaries, building maintenance. That's $60,000 a year. For as long as the children need it, could be 10 years. Could be 20. You're looking at somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million total. Johnson didn't hesitate. Do it, whatever it costs. Those children stay together. Within 3 weeks, Theodore Green had found a building, a former boarding house on West 138th Street that had been empty for 2 years, big enough for 32 children plus staff, structurally sound but needing renovation. Johnson bought it, paid cash, hired contractors to renovate, added bedrooms, updated the kitchen, created common areas where children could study and play, made it a home rather than an institution. He hired staff, a director with 20 years of experience in education, house parents who'd work in shifts to make sure children were always supervised, teachers to help with homework, a nurse for medical care, a cook who understood that feeding 32 children meant more than just putting food on tables. By January 1964, less than 2 months after Sarah Mitchell's death, the children moved into what Johnson called the Mitchell House, named after the woman who'd saved them first. The woman whose promise Johnson was keeping. And for the next 4 years, until his own death in July 1968, Bumpy Johnson paid every expense. Every dollar for food and clothes, every medical bill, every salary for staff. He visited the house regularly, knew the children by name, attended their school events when he could, made sure they understood that someone cared about their futures. The children never knew who was funding their home. They were told it was a charitable foundation. They didn't know that the foundation was actually Bumpy Johnson's illegal gambling profits being transformed into clothing and food and education and hope. When Johnson died in 1968, he'd spent approximately $427,000 on the Mitchell House, money that came from policy gambling, from numbers running, from the criminal enterprises that made him powerful and wealthy. But in his will, Johnson had established a trust, money set aside specifically to continue funding the Mitchell House, enough to keep it operating for another 15 years, enough to ensure that Sarah Mitchell's promise, and his promise to her, would be kept long after he was gone. Before we finish this story, if you made it this far, drop a comment telling us what country you're watching from, and subscribe, because the real measure of a person isn't what they did for themselves, but what they did for people who could never repay them. The Mitchell House operated until 1983, 20 years total. In that time, over 100 children lived there. Not just the original 32, but others who needed help. Children who were taken in because Sarah Mitchell had started something and Bumpy Johnson had refused to let it die with her. Most of those children went on to lead successful lives. Some became teachers, others nurses, mechanics, shop owners. One became a lawyer, another a social worker who dedicated her life to helping other children in situations like the one she'd survived. None of them knew for decades who had actually funded their home. They knew about Sarah Mitchell. Her photograph hung in the Mitchell House common room. Her story was told to every child who arrived, but Bumpy Johnson's role remained secret until 1983, when the Mitchell House closed and the trust that had funded it ran out. The last director, preparing to transfer the remaining children to other facilities, went through old files and discovered the truth. She discovered that every check for 20 years had come from the estate of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. She discovered the original notebook that Sarah Mitchell had given him. She discovered letters Johnson had written to the house director asking about specific children, making sure they were okay, requesting updates on their progress. She gathered the former residents, now adults, some with children of their own, and she told them the truth about who had saved them. The reaction was complicated. Some were angry that a criminal had funded their childhood. Others were grateful that someone had cared enough to spend nearly $500,000 to keep a promise to a dying woman. Most were simply stunned that Bumpy Johnson, the legend they'd heard about, the gangster who controlled Harlem, had been the reason they'd had food and shelter and the chance to become more than what they'd started as. One of the former residents, a woman named Patricia, who'd been 6 years old when Sarah Mitchell died, spoke at a reunion in 1985. "I don't care that Bumpy Johnson was a criminal," she said. "I don't care that his money came from illegal gambling. I care that when a dying woman asked him to help, he said yes. I care that he kept his promise for 20 years. I care that because of him, I went to school instead of living on the street. That I had clothes and food and people who loved me." Everyone wants to make this simple, to say he was a bad man or a good man. But life isn't simple. Bumpy Johnson was both. And the part of him that kept a promise to a dying woman, that saved over 100 children, that's the part I choose to remember. The story of Sarah Mitchell and Bumpy Johnson's promise became legend in Harlem, not publicized widely, not turned into news stories or celebrated publicly, but passed down through families, through communities, through the children who'd lived at the Mitchell house and who told their own children about the gangster who'd given them a future. That's the story of November 12th, 1963, the night a dying woman asked a criminal to save 32 children. The promise Bumpy Johnson made at a deathbed and kept for the rest of his life. The $500,000 he spent, not on himself, but on children who would never know his name until after he was gone. Because sometimes the measure of power isn't how much you control or how much you earn or how feared you are. Sometimes the measure of power is what you do with it when someone who has nothing asks you for everything. And sometimes the most important promises are the ones you keep in secret. The ones that don't make headlines. The ones that do aim, respect or gratitude or recognition. The ones you keep simply because you gave your word to someone who was dying and who trusted you with the futures of children who deserved better than what life had given them. That was Bumpy Johnson's promise, and he kept it.